Hello and welcome to Deep Sky Sanctuary. This is Eric on a fine spring day in North Texas. And the observatory. Is it not the dream of any amateur astronomer, whether you're visual or astrophotographer? It's this place where you can keep all of your equipment safe and secure. You don't have to lug it out every session. If there's a chance of cloud, you don't have to worry that you're just going to end up wasting your time and having to bring everything back inside. You don't have to wake up earlier before work to bring everything back in the house. Your life will be longer because you'll get better sleep with an observatory. You can keep your polar alignment because nothing moves. So if you want to go out with your wife or your friends or your girlfriend, you can just set up an automated session that runs while you're gone. You don't have to be there when night falls to do your polar alignment. So there's a lot of benefits to an observatory. Also, it just becomes this kind of sacred space where you associate that location with peering into the celestial wonders above us. So having an observatory is awesome. But it's not always feasible for all of us. Some of us just don't have a location where we could build a permanent structure like that, or maybe we just don't have the space to build a permanent structure like that. Some of us may not be able to afford something like that, or maybe some of us aren't sure if we're going to be living in that location long enough to build an observatory. So it's not always accessible to all of us. And for me, I fell into the category where my wife and I were not sure if we're going to be living in this house for a really long period of time. And it didn't really make sense for me to put in both the effort and the expenses of building this structure. And then, if we did move, try to repurpose it as just a normal shed or something like that. It didn't seem worth it for me to put in that effort with the risk of us not being here. But I did find myself in a situation where, I have been shooting 80 millimeter and under aperture since the beginning of my astrophotography career in 2018. So basically 5 years now. And I really decided it's time for me to move up. I love shooting that aperture, but I just wanted something a little bit bigger. So right now I'm shooting with the Esprit 120, and it's great, but even in the future I plan on, maybe getting an RC telescope, maybe a 10 or 12 inch or something like that. But really, with bigger aperture comes a bigger mount. So currently I am using the CEM 120. Which, if you don't know what that is, it's a very heavy mount. It's an observatory grade mount by Ioptron, and it is totally unfeasible to bring it inside and out of the house. And me too, I'm very prone and clumsy to banging things. Even with my smaller setup, I bang the door or bang walls all the time, and it would just be better for my equipment and my house to invest in a permanent setup. But again, I couldn't build an observatory, but I needed a place to store this mount and this telescope basically permanently in my backyard. So what was my solution? My solution was the TeleGizmos 365 cover. And I'll go into more detail as to what exactly it is, what it's made of. I'll show you it, and also whether I think it's actually living up to the name of being a 365 cover. But I had heard about this cover through Cloudy Nights, Stargazer Lounge, that's a UK forum, and I'd only heard really glowing reviews about how this cover is kind of miraculous in what it can do and the way that it can protect your equipment. So I decided to go that route. And all that being said, I'm really grateful I did. I love this cover and I want to tell you about it. and I want to tell you about some considerations you have to have, especially if you're using it as a permanent solution, not just a temporary. If you're just storing your equipment out for, say, a week at a time, or maybe like 3 days, where you think you have clear nights, the cover is just going to work phenomenally as it is. But if you're doing it more permanently, like I am, there are considerations that you're going to have to make that we'll get into. But first, let me just show you what it looks like for me to set up an imaging session now. Okay, so let's talk about the actual composition of the cover itself. So let's start from the inside. In here you see the shiny reflective material. This is some kind of radiant barrier. It's similar to what you would see in an attic or a garage. People put panels on these to keep, non-insulated spaces cooler during summer. So the idea of this is it'll prevent it from getting as hot inside by reflecting radiant heat. Radiant heat is heat that comes from light. One thing you do have to be careful with, though, is even though this is preventing radiant heat, you still have to worry about heat transferred via conduction. So if things are touching the edge of the cover, parts of your equipment, you will still have heat transferred through conduction. So it's not bulletproof, but this is a radiant barrier, and I assume it's good at what it does. There's been research as to how well that kind of insulation improves in garages and attics and things like that. So I'm sure it works pretty well. And on the outside, this is really where the magic sauce is, in my opinion. According to the website, this is acrylic woven polyester or something. I'm probably totally wrong there. But essentially, just by feeling this, you can really feel how durable this stuff is. There's not going to be any holes that poke through this. It's very durable material unless you intentionally do it. I mean, any natural circumstances. And this is what keeps rain out. This is what keeps snow out. This is what protects against the high winds. This protects against UV electromagnetic radiation. And this stuff is awesome. For me personally, it's already been through hail, snow, very high winds, and lots of rain, and my sprinklers. So this stuff holds up really well. And according to the website, there should be no more shrinkage than 1% with this material, which is amazing. That means it's going to fit your equipment forever. So really impressed with this. It looks really good still. I've had this for 6 months now, and it looks great. You also see there's this drawstring here. This is to cinch it tighter towards the bottom. And then you have this drawstring, which is an external one that you could also use to cinch it more where you want. So sometimes if I have my sprinklers going off and I know they might come up from the bottom, I'll cinch this more. But yeah, that's a basic overview. So you have the radiant barrier on the inside, and then this fancy stuff on the outside that performs great from my experience. Okay, so now that you've seen sort of the way that I set up, how easy it is. It takes, a minute basically, and I'm ready to go. Everything's polar aligned. And also showing you sort of an overview of the materials used and how the cover kind of functions. I wanted to answer the question, do I think that this cover can be used 365 days a year, 24 hours 7, for long stretches of time and protect your equipment? I think the answer is yes and no. It is no for somebody that thinks they're just going to be able to put the cover on their equipment with no foresight or precautions and expect their stuff to be fine. There's some obvious precautions. One is you need to be able to trust your neighbors because there's not really a good way to secure it outside. I mean, I have a security camera that I use to see if it's clear out or to check on the weather, make sure the cover's not blown off or anything like that. But the bigger precaution, I would say, for me, because I'm willing to take that risk of, things being stolen, which is a high risk, no matter how much you trust your neighbors. But the second and more important one for me is the conditions of where you live is going to be very important. And I live in a pretty extreme place, I would say. Which is why if I'm confident in this cover, I think if you live somewhere with more mild conditions, you'll be even better off than I am. And for here, there's two main things I was worried about. One was moisture, condensation forming on my equipment underneath. Humidity is typically pretty high here. Relative humidity this morning was 90%. So I knew I would have to deal with that. And then secondly, summer. It can get very, very hot here for long stretches of time, and I'm talking, 100 to 105 Fahrenheit easily, which I know we're going to get this summer at least. So all that being said, I haven't gone through a summer with this cover, but I'm confident I'll figure out solutions to keep things cool enough in there. And it's probably going to look different than my setup is right now. But primarily what I was worried about is condensation forming on my equipment. So the first thing that I did was I got one of these hydrometers, and that measures the temperature and the relative humidity in there, and I just can look at it on my phone. It's great. So I constantly monitor the conditions in there. I have this Ava Dry. They're rechargeable beads, and yeah, it's supposed to be a dehumidifier. And then I also had a firearm heating rod that's actually under the cover right now. I'll show a picture of what that looks like though. I think it's only 7 watts, so it's not emitting a ton of light. And what I found after just having this and the heating rod underneath the cover, when I was looking at the temperatures, I noticed that there was perfect parity between the temperature outside and inside the cover, and that the relative humidity was the same as well. And, my first thought was, they have to be doing something, right? But that was a mistake. Always trust the measurements. This is coming from somebody that should know better with a master's in physics. And just within 1 week, I noticed rust forming on the focuser of the Esprit 120. And I freaked out. Thankfully, I was able to remove it with white vinegar. But, it was a close call. And I realized I needed a heavier duty solution. And for me, that was a reptile heating pad. So sometimes people will use incandescent light bulbs because you can get high wattage. They emit a lot of heat. But there is a hazard there because the heat is being emitted from one source. And, one small area, small volume. And I didn't want to risk that, and I saw on cloudy nights somebody had come up with this idea of using a reptile heating pad, and I think it's great because you can get a lot of heat emitted, but it's spread out over a big surface. So I'll show a picture of what that looks like as well. It's also underneath the cover. And basically, once I got that, I still use the heating rod to help a little bit with heat. I don't think it does anything still. It's mainly the reptile heating pad. But ever since I got that, I haven't had to worry at all about humidity. So the ways to fight the condensation from forming on things are, one, to keep things much higher than the dew point. right? So if you have higher humidity, there's usually a closer gap between the outdoor temperature and the dew point, where at that temperature condensation forms on your stuff. So you want to either raise your temperature or decrease humidity. Thankfully, this solution does both. So I'm always like 20 or 30% lower than the relative humidity outside, and the temperature is always at least 10 degrees hotter, which works great. And ever since then, there's literally no blemish on any of my stuff, and it looks great. So that's an example of the type of thing you have to think through and think about. A second one is, for example, here we get winds as well, and one thing to be careful with is you don't want to destroy your mount's worm gear if there's a ton of wind pushing against it. So, I have to keep the axle locked on my mount instead of having the worm gear hold things together, because in those high wind conditions, it could destroy the worm gear. So just thinking through certain things like that. But really, it's not much effort after you figure those initial things out. You also want to look out for things like rodents, but you have to do that with most observatories. Maybe it's a little bit more difficult. But we also get lots of bugs and stuff here, and I really haven't had any issues at all, but we'll see in summer. So I think if you are willing to take those precautions, this is a great solution, but again, it's not a one-stop shop. And yeah, those are kind of my thoughts about, whether I think it's a 365 solution. Also note that this cover comes in many different sizes. Most people typically recommend to get a size bigger than your actual telescope. For me, I didn't do that because you might have saw in the footage earlier, I actually have a cover as well. They make one for the tripod of your mount. And I ended up getting one of those, so I got the right size cover for mine, and everything's completely covered. So that's one thing. I think if you weren't getting the tripod one and say you had it on a pier, maybe go one size higher so you could cinch it at the bottom however you want. But yeah, this is an excellent cover. I'm really happy with it. It lets me image very fast. Every Thursday I have to drive into the city, and I always drive before it's dark so I don't have time to polar line. I'm always able to get data on that night now. And also, I just image so much more, not having to lug things in and out. Even if there's only going to be a couple hours of clear sky, it's so easy to do it that I'm able to get that data. So it's a highly recommended product by me, with the proper precautions. And again, if you're just leaving your equipment out for a few days at a time, you really probably don't have to worry about a lot of those things as much. But if you are leaving it out 365 days a year, like I'm planning to, you have to think through things a little bit more. But it's really such an excellent product for the price of what you're getting with this. It seems overpriced at first, but in my opinion, it's really not once you see how well the cover performs. And yeah, I highly recommend it, and wanted to share that with you. Okay, with all that being said, is this a replacement for an observatory? And I think the answer is obviously no. The observatory, you get a lot more benefits. You are able to store more equipment in there. Right now I could realistically, maybe have 2 telescopes under the cover, like a small refractor on top of the Esprit 120. But yeah, you don't have the same storage solutions. You don't have that concept of being able to sit in something and just have it be almost like your astro cave. And that's something that I think is really cool. So I actually still plan on building an observatory. I'm actually in the market to buy some local land in the mountains, the Kiamichi Mountains, maybe early next year. And my plan is to build a remote observatory out there. So this is great practice for, having an automated session. And also I think in terms of things like climate control and stuff that you have in an observatory that's going to be much easier to do. Also, just the level of automation that you could have. You could automate the roll-off roof, you could have it react to weather conditions. That is one thing with the cover, is if there's random rain, you basically have to rush outside because there's nothing you could program to put that cover on for you. So those are just a few things I wanted to leave with. It's not a replacement for an observatory, but you get about 80% there, which is great, and it's really improved my rate of imaging pretty much to the same extent as I think if I had built an observatory. I'm just a little bit more anxious about the weather than I might have been if I built an automated observatory. But I'll leave you with all that information, and I'm looking forward to continuing mosaic I'm making of Makarian's chain tonight. I'm doing a 2-panel horizontal mosaic, and maybe in the next video I'll have the final product to show you. But thank you for watching, and clear skies.